Hi everyone, my name is Paris McCollum, and today I will be discussing a few things about the film The 13th, or 13th. To further explain, I will be discussing my initial reaction, a few key notes on a few quotes, how this film characterizes the criminal justice system, the war on drugs and the war on crime, Merton's enemy theory, and how I felt from my own personal experiences. My initial reaction from the film was shock, because I didn't know the statistics behind the incarceration rates in America. But after watching this, I will forever keep that statistic with me because that is absolutely ridiculous. Basically, the rates in America are like this. 5% of the world's population is in the United States. However, 25% of the world's prison population is also in the U.S. That statistic is shocking and disgusting in my opinion. After watching this film, I felt disgusted and inspired. Immediately, I was thinking of ways to reduce incarceration rates and thinking of what actually caused the incarceration rates to get so high. The most surprising thing I learned from this film was probably the statistics behind the incarceration rates in America, but also learning about Alec. That was also shocking. Previously, I did not know anything about Alec, but now I know that well-known establishments were involved in the making of policies and laws that incarcerated quite a few people. What was also shocking was Bill Clinton's involvement in the incarceration rates. That is probably why they're so high today. The 3 strikes you're out rule, Clinton's support of the death penalty was surprising, and the entire federal crime bill. They were honestly surprising to learn about. I think a great example that captures the quotes, systems of oppression are durable and they often reinvent themselves, and historically, when one looks at efforts to create reforms, they inevitably lead to more repression. Would be the criminalization that occurred after the slaves were emancipated. I think these 2 quotes are extremely important for U.S. history and in general. But to speak bluntly, after African Americans were free, many laws were put in place that prevented African Americans from basic human rights. These laws prevented African Americans from voting, and they were often arrested for trivial, petty crimes, while white people were just getting a slap on the wrist. So, I guess to combat this, somebody came up with the idea of segregation, which they must have thought would solve all their problems surrounding race. But of course, this was a terrible idea, as we should all be colorblind when it comes to race. But many films during this time depicted the African Americans as monsters. Even a 1915 film called Birth of a Nation depicted this idea and was possibly even directly responsible for the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. They even added the concept of cross-burning for the Ku Klux Klan, and they adopted this practice. Another way we can talk about these quotes, systems of oppression are durable and they often reinvent themselves, and historically, when one looks at efforts to create reforms, they inevitably lead to more repression, could be the tough on crime bill. This bill creates repression because of the excessive punitive policies that targeted marginalized communities, particularly the black communities. These policies were put in place or excessive, and they arrested many individuals for small amounts of crack cocaine, which populated our prisons even more. This film characterizes our criminal justice system as racist, political, and economic. The system is not just a neutral provider of public safety, but it acts as a tool that controls marginalized communities, punishes those who dissent, and makes a profit. This film shapes my understanding of the prison system by realizing that it targets minority groups. It's a political gain for campaigning for presidency, and that the prisons are unnecessarily crowded. My pre-existing views were changed when I heard about a lot of the cases surrounding this film, but one in particular was the arrest of Kalief Browder. Kalief was a teenage boy walking home with his friends when suddenly he's stopped by police who tell him to come down to the station and ultimately charge him with a crime he did not commit. And since Kalief didn't commit this crime, he did not want to take a plea deal because, he didn't commit it, so why is he going to say that he did? So, he tries to get a trial, which takes him 3 years to get. 3 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. The prison systems are so corrupt, so brutal, that Kalief tried to commit suicide on multiple occasions. And ultimately, after 2 years of being free, the damage was already done, and Kalief died by suicide at 22. This case altered my views of the prison system, as I used to have a sliver of hope that this type of stuff didn't happen. But what happened to Kalief Browder is absolutely unacceptable. Before watching this film, I had very limited knowledge on the war on crime and the war on drugs. But I was very surprised to learn about the racial underpinnings of the legislative policies. It was like the government's secret way to continue to criminalize minorities. Richard Nixon coined the term war on drugs. He doubled the federal spending for law enforcement, and he sent hundreds of thousands of people in jail for simple. He sent hundreds of thousands of people to jail for simple possession of drugs. Simple drug possession. Nixon even admitted that the war on drugs was to throw the anti-war crowd and the blacks in jail. However, it wasn't until Ronald Reagan that the war on drugs became a literal war on drugs in 1982. But from 1980 to 1985, the prison population in the U.S. rose about from 514,000 to 759,000 prison inmates. That is ridiculous. There were also many examples in the film that played an active role in targeting and criminalizing minority groups. One instance was when Reagan's campaign strategist was caught on tape admitting to the Southern strategy, explaining how it works, which ultimately results in blacks being hurt worse than whites. Merton's enemy theory looks at deviance as something that happens when there's a disconnect between the goals society values, like the American dream, and the legitimate ways to achieve them. But opportunities to get to the top are extremely limited. When pathways to success are blocked due to poverty, exclusion, or racism, people might get creative and resort to deviant or criminal methods to get what they want. We can see this all throughout the film, but one way was how the African Americans were criminalized after being emancipated. I know I keep on saying this, but I feel like that is very important to discuss. In this film, we see African Americans being arrested for petty crimes, while the whites are getting slapped on the wrist, as I previously said. And one way we can see this is by the case of George Zimmerman. I know this case was in 2005, but it's ridiculous that from the freedom of slaves to segregation to 2005, I mean, this is like big gaps in history. But George Zimmerman was put on trial for the murder of Trayvon Martin. And Trayvon was a young black man walking down the street, minding his own business, when George Zimmerman called 911 and said, "Hey, look, there's a suspicious male walking down the street. I'm gonna follow him." And they're like, "No, please don't do that." But he decides to follow Trayvon. Ultimately, George gets in an altercation with Trayvon and shoots him as Trayvon dies. Trayvon dies, and George is put on trial, but because of the stand your ground law, George is found not guilty. Not guilty for the murder of a young man that he killed without reason. I don't agree with this verdict, and yeah. So after watching this film, I feel extremely, extremely lucky to be a middle-class, straight white female. I have all the basic identifiers, and I feel very advantaged because I will likely not encounter the criminal justice system. I feel extremely lucky, but also very angry for my peers who may experience this type of violent, unacceptable behavior from the criminal justice system that we saw in the film. And I pray that the criminal justice system improves and becomes a less corrupt place. I pray that it looks less racially targeted, and that over time we can decrease the prison population, because that is ridiculous. And I want to say I have hope for the future, but honestly, I'm not sure if that's true or not. I hope, but I don't know. I guess only time will tell. So to conclude, I talked about a lot of different things. I talked about my initial reaction to the film 13th. I drew information from the film to discuss a few key quotes. I talked about how the film characterized the criminal justice system, the war on drugs, the war on crime, Merton's enemy theory, and my own personal experiences. I think this film is very important for people to watch, especially if they don't know much about the criminal justice system and prison population and just all these things that every American should know, and I think it's very important. Thank you.